Welcome to the Deep Collaboration podcast from CoScreen. My name is Max Sandocker, and in today's episode I'm joined by my co-founder Till Pieper in talking to Jake Saper from Emergence Capital. Jake is just like us a strong believer in the topic of deep collaboration and the impact it will have on the future of work. I hope you enjoy it. So welcome to the Deep Collaboration podcast. I'm here today with my co-founder and CEO Till Pieper in talking to Jake Saper, who is a general partner at Emergence Capital, which coincidentally also invested in apps like Box, Yammer, and Zoom, which I guess carries some resemblance to what we're doing here at CoScreen. Can you start by telling us a bit more about yourself and how you became a venture capitalist in the first place?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Max, and thanks, Till, for having me. I'm excited to be here. And the quick backstory is, you guys were writing about this concept of deep collaboration at the same time we were. And so I was really excited to have the initial conversation with Till and excited to spend more time with you both and learn more about what you're up to. So thanks for having me, and thank you for kind of building in this ecosystem. In terms of my background and my journey to venture, I grew up in Austin, Texas. This was Austin in the 80s and 90s before it was infiltrated by my VC brethren. It's a different city then. But I did grow up kind of in the first tech boom in Austin in the 90s. My parents are actually co-founders and have started a bunch of tech companies together. So I kind of grew up in that environment and therefore always knew I would do something kind of in and around the entrepreneurial ecosystem. I did consulting out of college. I'm a super structured thinker, perhaps a little bit German in that sense. I like frameworks a lot, and consulting was really good for me. I then did an entrepreneurial venture. I helped run a startup that was developing solar power plants in India and Africa. So we build, own, and operate these very large power plants and sell the power to the governments, which was wonderful and terrible and stressful and awesome and all the things a startup is, plus living in Mumbai and, selling to governments. We did end up building about $75 million worth of power plants across a bunch of different countries. So we had some success, but it was a journey, and I have a lot of respect for the entrepreneurial journey as a result of that. Came back to California for grad school. That's how I got back to the US. Then kind of transitioned into venture capital and have been in venture for about 8 years now. And I love it. It's the best job I've ever had. It's the last job I hope to have. So I feel very grateful I get to do this.
That's awesome. And you're actually still in San Francisco. So can you tell us, like, as an insider, why you didn't go back? I mean, are all the folks wrong to move to Texas?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I'm taking the contrarian stance now for VC and staying in San Francisco. No, we have a great life here. We have lots of great friends. I mean, I'm ultimately a believer in community and like choosing where you live based upon where your community, is. And I've got a lot of amazing friends in Austin and other places. My wife and I both went to grad school here. As a result, we have a high concentration of friends, and I still love it here. Like I still think that there's an amazing vibe and intellectual curiosity and optimism here that is really special. So I still love going back to Austin, and I'm excited that more and more of my peers are there, so I have more excuses to go. And increasingly Miami as well. It's a little bit further, but like I'm excited to spend time there as well. But I will very likely remain here in San Francisco.
Awesome. Thanks for the context. No, I mean, you mentioned you wrote the post about deep collaboration, and that of course sparked our curiosity because we thought of for a long time how we coin CoScreen. Like what we do is quite unique with multi-user collaboration in any app on OS level. And I think actually one of our angels, John Lilly, from ex-Mozilla CEO, came up with that and said, hey, this is a great deep collaboration solution. We said, deep collaboration, that's maybe something that might stick. And that's how we ran with that. And then when we saw your post, we said, okay, we think alike, and we noticed we had a few joint connections, and that's when we thought we might reach out. But I still love to hear your story, how you came up with the urge to write this post. Yeah.
So I'll first get just some context in the firm and kind of how we do things, because I think it plays into it. So
yep.
We're a thesis-based venture firm. All we do is enterprise software. It's all we've ever done. It's all we ever will do. The firm was started 20 years ago with a thesis that software would move from on-prem to the cloud. That thesis obviously has been a good one. The very first investment in the early 2000s was in Salesforce, and we've invested in a lot of bigger, there are companies that have gone on to become reasonably large companies, including SuccessFactors, which is now part of SAP. Till's alma mater. So we have a long history of kind of investing in productivity and collaboration applications. As Max said, we also invested in Zoom and Yammer and other collaboration tooling. And I think what we started to notice is that there were kind of two dynamics taking place. One was there's been an increasing proliferation of applications, both in terms of where we go to actually do our work and then where we go to talk about our work. That proliferation is becoming harder and harder because there's more and more information fragmentation that takes place the more applications there are. And then the other thing that happened, which was obviously less gradual, more abrupt, was the global pandemic. And that obviously forced us to change the way that we collaborate. I mean, ultimately, prior to COVID, collaboration tooling was largely used to do lighter weight work, where it was kind of task management and kind of communicating a little bit higher level or more detailed kind of tasks. But the idea was less like when you got something really hard where you want to build something together that's really difficult, you'd often do it in person. Like you'd wait to go to the whiteboard or you'd sit next to each other and pair program or whatever the case may be. What's happened obviously in COVID is that's changed everything. And I think post-COVID, as we, at least in the US, start to recover, and God willing, other places will soon as well, the way that we're going to work will be very least be hybrid. And so we're going to have to rethink the tech stack to enable us to work together more effectively in this kind of hybrid world. And so the concept that we started to think about is, hey, should we start thinking about bringing together the productivity tooling, the kind of where work gets done, with the collaboration tooling, kind of where work gets talked about, and unite it around a specific job to be done, and bring this concept of like task specific, concept to software building, and move away from the more kind of persona based software building model that has existed for many years. My colleague Joe Floyd kind of originally started thinking about this, and we started brainstorming as a team and started to learn from our portfolio companies, some of which had started to make these transitions themselves and start to serve these needs in different jobs to be done. And then we spent a while trying to figure out what we would call this thing. And we came up with lots of different names. In context collaboration was one that was very attractive because it's more descriptive. It's like, okay, all the collaboration's happening in the context of the work itself. There was a bunch of other long lists that we went through, and ultimately chose deep for two reasons. One is because we wanted to convey the sense of focus that you're able to get when you're actually in the flow. I'm a musician. Like I grew up as an opera singer, and now I play a little guitar and piano. And I know what it's like to be in the flow as a musician. And it's really hard to get into that same place of flow when you're working, because you're constantly pivoting between a million different applications to get that job done. So the idea of being like in a deep state of flow is one concept. And the other idea was just the depth was narrowing. So the idea here is, don't try to build a horizontal tool where you're trying to do everything. Instead, be more narrowly or deeply focused on solving a specific job to be done. So it's a long answer to your question, but that's the provenance of the Deep Collab naming. And then, when I saw that you folks were kind of talking about the same concept, it was like, whoa, other people think the same way. That's really validating.
Yeah, I think many of us saw things like Figma, which I think, overtook the design space, where I think you mentioned that as an example too, and I think it's a great one, because you can work from all the way from wireframing to the full mock-up to prototyping in one app. Everything is collaborative. The interesting thing is it's not that you have to be online at the same time with everyone all the time. It's just like you can, and that's what makes it different. Of course, the other things like runs in the browser, don't have to install anything. You can take it with you no matter if you're on your phone, mobile device, or elsewhere, and it's not just desktop bound. But this multi-user ability and the super easy entry, you can just instantly share access to a document via a link. By default, I think it's shared. It's a very powerful thing, and that's something we all looking up for. Yeah,
agreed. I mean, Figma has been certainly like a big example of the success pursuing this concept. I would say like part of what made Figma so intriguing and so successful as an example of a deep collaboration company is something that we call dropping the ER. And specifically what that means is that if you think about what life existed before kind of Figma, and you use kind of Adobe as the predecessor tech stack for that concept, Adobe was built for designers. That was the concept. That was the persona Adobe was building for.
Yeah.
Figma is built for design. And that's a really important, subtle, but really, really important distinction. And so what that means is that Figma is encouraging cross-functional collaboration. And so it's not just designers that are working in Figma. You've also got product managers, and you've got product marketers and everything else that are able to actually do that job to be done of design together in one place, and don't have to scatter that collaboration across lots of different other applications, or in some cases just not be involved in the process at all, because the tooling was built for a persona versus a job to be done.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in hindsight, it's a success, right? But I think it took them a few years to figure it out, but they stayed true to the core of just focusing on design and also not starting, to go broad too early. And I think they just launched their whiteboarding tool, FigJam, a few weeks ago, maybe 5-6 years into their journey, which I think is quite astonishing how long they stuck with this one system that folks worked in.
Yeah. Look, I think the way I think about this in terms of what does success look like for a deep collaboration company, I'd say the single most important metric of success is asking a user what portion of their job to be done they're doing within that piece of software. And to get to an answer of 100 there, or 100%, you have to be really, really fully featured around that job to be done. You have to be built in such a way that people don't want to do some work here and then slack about it in another place. That there's a real switching cost to putting the information outside of the application. And I think it takes time and care and attention and effort to get to a place with a specific application where that's the case.
What else do you see in the other verticals? So obviously Figma is a great example, but are you bullish about how this will develop for other jobs to be done as well? Or are most companies still taking the persona approach that you talked about?
Well, I would say that it's still early days in the deep collab, concept. But there's a ton of stuff I'm excited about. Another kind of job to be done that I think is starting to see some real success in the deep collaboration space is contracting, specifically legal contracting, which is a task or a job to be done that is by definition cross-functional, involves the legal function and then procurement if it's procurement, or hiring, HR if it's hiring, or hiring managers, et cetera. There's whatever the contract is, it involves lots of people in the organization. And the way that used to be done was, starting a contract in Word and then emailing and Slacking and texting and calling and Zooming and everything else back and forth to get approvals and, edits and what have you, version control issues, et cetera. And then doing the same thing externally to negotiate with your counterpart. There's companies like Ironclad, on whose board I serve, which are trying to deliver the same concept all in one place. So it's the productivity tooling where you're actually doing the contract drafting and the editing and such, as well as the collaboration features where you can actually get feedback and, solicit input and provide permissioning, et cetera, all within one place. So all the context around the legal contract kind of resides, in a single destination, and it's a much smoother experience for everyone that touches it. I think the other thing I'd say about companies like Ironclad that make them really special and similar to Figma is that if you do this well, you end up getting a lot of this cross-functional collaboration. And so in Ironclad's case, the majority of the usage it gets is actually outside of the legal space, meaning that legal users in a company are the minority of usage of their product. The majority of usage is folks outside of the budget center, which is something that's very powerful when you move from a persona-based mentality to a job-to-be-done-based mentality.
Fascinating. I think definitely for CoScreen, we're focusing on deep collaboration for engineering teams, but we can see that as well. We can see how the job to be done and the use cases are so much more important, and it will also be a matter of the engineer connecting with the designer or connecting with me and Till as product people. What else have you seen in the engineering space? And what are your thoughts on the development of that? I think the reality we live in is that engineers, they tend to have very versatile tooling, different debug tools they need to use, and different type of IDEs, which is why we're taking that approach. But what else are you seeing in this space?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's a lot of interesting stuff bubbling up in the dev space, but it's still also early there. I think what you guys are building in CoScreen is really promising. I think there's companies like SourceGraph, which I think are doing interesting things to help kind of facilitate some collaboration between developers. I also think, and you alluded to this before, I think that there's tooling. The reality is engineers should be connected to functions outside of just the engineering function. And the best tooling, I think, will help pull them into the jobs to be done that are relevant for. So I'll give you an example. We are invested in a company called Maze, and Maze is focused on the product research process. And the idea here is that the way product research typically works in a pre-deep collaboration world is, you as a PM come up with an idea, and you may create it, put this into a Google Doc and start to, get some feedback from your colleagues. You then may, maybe you spin up a SurveyMonkey or a Typeform to get some, qualitative feedback from potential users. You then may, do a user testing, kind of a bunch of video interviews as well. And then you may, spin up, some engineering resources to actually start building the thing. You get an MVP, then you get the MVP to people, you get feedback, et cetera. It's kind of a messy process. And as a result, it actually results, I think, in a lot of wasted engineering resources because you're developing product that, hasn't actually been properly researched. The concept with a deep collaboration platform like Maze around product research is you plug into the prototyping tools, the Figmas of the world, or InVision or Adobe or what have you, and then you can take that and then create a link that allows a user to walk through a mock of the application with no engineering code behind it, and then be able to actually see quantitatively where people are spending time in the prototype. You can also embed SurveyMonkey-like functionality in there as well to get qualitative data, push all that into the results into a document that can be shared instead of putting it into a separate Google slide, having that all native within the software, and then having the collaboration features around that as well. So you can mention people and get their feedback, et cetera, et cetera. The thing that's really exciting about that product is that, researchers theoretically are the core concept here, but the majority of the usage actually takes place outside of the researcher persona. It's more kind of in the product manager persona and increasingly actually the engineering persona. Back to the earlier question, because the idea is engineers want to understand the context around what the thing is that they're building. One mistake I think that's happened is we've kind of the rise of the product manager. I think the rise of the product manager has had lots of positive things. But one of the things that I think it has done in some cases is removing context from the engineering team around why are they building this? Who is the end user they're building for? And I think that the beauty of the concept of deep collaboration is we can start to bring, people back into a process and at least inform them of the context around a job to be done versus siloing things the way that I think our kind of structures have done recently.
In all of this, do you see any risk that too many tools will sort of develop their own variants of deep collaboration and we'll end up having to keep track of, 20, 30 tools just because we're involved in all these different works to be done, right? Especially, I'm sure it's the same thing, but for you, but for me and Till as founders, we find ourselves being semi-experts on a lot of different topics, just to keep this boat afloat.
Totally. It's such a good question, Max. I mean, to me, it's kind of the existential question around this concept. Is this just adding yet more applications? Is this making the problem worse? Here's kind of the way I view the successful future, and I can talk about how the future may not come to pass and could be worse. But here's what I view as the successful future. So in the successful future, a product manager, let's talk about what a product manager's life looks like today. So a PM today has a series of jobs to be done. To your point, Max, you've got to be doing design, you've got to be doing research, you've got to be doing hiring, you've got to be doing, there's all sorts of subtasks within hiring in terms of, interviewing and then the legal contract of the hiring, et cetera. You got to be doing project management. You probably have a dozen core jobs to be done that you have to be tackling. And then there's a bunch of random stuff outside of the, standard jobs to be done that you may have to deal with crisis stuff, et cetera. What happens today is that, within each of those jobs to be done, the PM is bouncing around between lots of horizontal applications or applications that don't bring together productivity and collaboration. So we talked about what research looks like without deep collaboration. We're kind of bouncing between all these things. We talked about kind of pre-Figma design. You'd be bouncing between, Adobe perhaps, and then sending files back and forth and then trying to get input over Slack. And so you're, even within a job to be done, you're bouncing around a lot. The vision in kind of deep collaboration future is there's one application for each of those core jobs to be done. You still will need to go to change between jobs to be done as you change your job, right? Meaning as through the course of the day, people generally do have to do multiple things. So I've got to deal with hiring today and I've got to deal with the design stuff. And so you spend half your day in Figma and half your day in a deep collaboration tool built for hiring. So there's still application switching, but two things are really important to note. The first is that you don't have the data loss that comes with the pre-world because the contextual data you need for a specific job to be done is all within the application that you're doing that work in. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is you are removing one critical layer of spaghetti, one critical layer of command tab frustration or whatever you want to call it, because within the application, you're not doing all the pivoting. So there's definitely still some pivoting that will take place between jobs between applications, but the vision is that you remove, at least half of that burden by moving to this model. Yeah, and I guess also when you're focusing on a certain topic, you can sort of really devote yourself to that and go deep. Speaking of deep collaboration, and not be disturbed by everything else that's going on, right? If you're trying to manage the product in Slack, whatever generic collaboration tool you're working in. Yeah.
just on one point that you mentioned in your post, which is collaboration software is increasingly at odds with productivity. That's, I think, the opposite of what some of us would have thought in the beginning of the pandemic, when there was a hype around Zoom and of course Notion and Slack and so on. And it seems things have cooled down in some areas. There's fatigue about certain tools or so. But what do you mean with that?
Yeah. So I think that the challenge with horizontal collaboration tooling is that it pulls you out of your job to be done, right? By definition, like you do work in one place and you go somewhere else to collaborate around it. There's still a really important need for horizontal tooling. And I think it happens in horizontal collaboration tooling. It happens in two ways. The first is outside of core jobs to be done, there's still a need for for horizontal collaboration tooling, right? Because while you as a PM, your day may fall into 12 core jobs to be done. You'll have 12 applications to do those things. There's still going to be exception handling. This is something that a term that Kevin Kwok came up with. It's concept that like you're doing something outside of the flow. There's also a place to like share cat memes, right? There's a place to be silly. There's a place for firm-wide communication where it's like, hey, there's this big important thing you got to know about, et cetera. So there's going to be still a need for a place to collaborate outside of core jobs to be done. So there's still be a need for Slack and Zoom and other things. But I think the other way in which these applications are going to play a really important role going forward is Zoom is increasingly, building out this concept of itself as a platform. And the reason it's doing that is because building job to be done specific applications on top of Zoom infrastructure is in many ways a better use of the infrastructure than just being a horizontal tool, right? And so you're seeing companies, there's a company that we've invested in called Class, and very simply, it is a classroom built on top of the Zoom SDK. So you click into Class as the desktop application, but you pop up and it's using Zoom infrastructure, but it's its own application. And the idea is it's bringing together all the collaboration tooling you need with the productivity tooling to have a class. So you have your assignments and your grades and, your breakout rooms as it results to small collaboration, whatever. All the things you need to do to have a class effectively takes place within this software versus the way that, a lot of, pandemic teaching has taken place. And those of you that have older kids, I guess, have experienced this where, you may be in Zoom for the class itself, but then you're in Google Classroom to manage assignments and you're in email to deal with the back and forth of, some attendance issue, or you're still like doing lots of different things in different places. The vision of an application like Class is to leverage the horizontal collaboration infrastructure of Zoom, but then build job to be done specific functionality on top of it. So I'm like super bullish on that concept. And in many ways, it seems like what you're building at CoScreen is kind of a concept around that, which is taking some, horizontal collaboration infrastructure, but making it very job to be done specific.
Right. And I think it's a bit unique because we figured, just like Max elaborated earlier, that engineers are a unique kind in the sense of they use a variety of tools. Unlike designers, for example, now with Figma, like you have so many different stacks, you have different operating systems, you have different command line tools, different IDEs, different extensions, different engineers are also very opinionated about their stack, and you can't just suddenly move them to another tool. I think they might be the most, in that sense, opinionated about their stack. And we thought you need an operating system layer of deep collaboration to enable them to collaborate on any app. It doesn't have to be browser-based. It doesn't have to be collaborative. It's fine if you use an older version than what I use. It's okay if I use a different keyboard and use a different, display resolution. It should all be compatible, no matter what you use. So you kind of leave them the choice of their preferred stack. And it's interesting, right? It's a bit of a unique outlier in the collaboration space because most other folks either build horizontal communication tools, and I would say, that's what you see mostly in the space is more about communicating, not much about doing. And the doing is typically happening now in the browser. But also we talked about, I think, earlier about sound and other domains. Like we know that music production is something that we've been approached about, to collaborate on music. We know about another startup that works on kind of a Figma for 3D design, for CAD and for production of hardware pieces. I think we just see much more on that. We just have a hard time seeing that happening for engineers just because it's such a uniquely diverse workflow. And we think that is here to stay.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, these deep collaboration applications are going to have to be tailored to the job to be done and the people that do those jobs, right? So you can't just, an example, back to the Ironclad example, you could have built your own word processor and tried to get people to use that on top of your collaboration tooling. And what the founders realized there, the CEO is an ex-lawyer, so he gets this space really well, is that like lawyers aren't going to leave Word. Like they're going to do their work in Microsoft Word. And so if you build a product, even if it's really awesome, that isn't actually Microsoft Word, they won't use it. And so he built Ironclad around the horizontal productivity tooling that is Microsoft Word, but he built his own job to be done specific collaboration and productivity tooling around that kind of wrapper. And that's working for that particular, use case, persona, et cetera. But, developers are a different beast. There's no one Microsoft Word style product on the productivity suite for developers. So you have to address it from a different angle.
But I think it's great if it works for lawyers, because that means it might work for everyone. We've tried to convince our counsels, which we're very happy about otherwise, to convince, to use them something else, but sending around Word files. And so far we haven't succeeded. So it would be nice if someone would break through that.
Hopefully give it time. Right now, Ironclad's focused on general counsels. So like once CoScreen gets big enough that you hire your own lawyer, then you can hop onto the Ironclad.
Okay.
That's awesome. You mentioned the hybrid and how many companies will go back to some sort of hybrid mode later on. Like, how will this impact the deep collaboration space? You think we'll see new approaches popping up? Do you think the approaches that worked in a remote environment will also work in a hybrid environment? Yeah.
I mean, the first thing I'd say on that is I think hybrid's actually going to be the hardest. I think, a lot of companies have been forced into, this kind of distributed mode post-COVID, because they may have been based in San Francisco or Austin or something prior to COVID. And then they, everyone went remote and they started hiring engineers or whomever everywhere. And so now they have this kind of awkward dynamic where they've got half the company in one city and half the company like everywhere. And there's going to be real leadership and management challenges that I think CEOs are going to face to try to figure out how to actually bridge that world and not create this like second-class citizen status of the people that are remote and people that are in HQ. That's going to be a really hard thing to manage. So in some ways, I think it's actually going to be easier if you've decided to go back to fully in-person, same, office co-location kind of thing. Or if you've decided to say, we are a fully distributed company, there's no hub. So, I mean, company will pull off the hybrid thing. I just think it's going to be harder to do. I think that the role of deep collaboration software becomes important in, all of these worlds. Like ultimately, if you believe as I said at the beginning, if in a world where, the original tooling was built for the original world where you just had one model, really practically you had one model. There was, some outliers, but mostly there was just one model. We don't have one model. There's going to be a lot of different models. And so you need collaboration tooling that's flexible enough to help people manage all those models effectively. So I think that post-COVID, there's going to be a diversity of how people go about doing this stuff. And it's going to make the need for really great deep collaboration software even bigger.
Looking at the pandemic, we're getting to the end of it, hopefully, as vaccination rates are picking up. But how did you change your own workflow when all of this happened? And would you say that you were still able to foster some form of serendipity, say random moments of innovation while being remote?
Well, I mean, first of all, the thing that's been really difficult is that in the US, we're starting to come out of this, but talking to folks in other parts of the world, we're still definitely in the throes of it. So, it's thoughts are with, folks in India and other places that are still really going through a hard time. Myself personally, I don't think I'm necessarily I'm not great at this stuff. Like in terms of actually improving my own workflows. There is no deep collaboration for the jobs to be done that are a venture capitalist's life, because that would be a tiny market that no one would want to invest in. So no one should build tooling for me, although it would make my life easier. I mean,
hint to our listeners, there's an opportunity there.
Yeah, there's an opportunity, but I feel the market might be too small. Like I think probably like many others have started to find ways to use products like Zoom for what I would call like quasi-social experiences. So like early in the pandemic, I played a lot of games over Zoom with folks, and I still think that like I'm still closer with a lot of my friends that don't live in San Francisco now than I was a year ago or 2 years ago, because we got into the habit of just like getting into regular Zoom check-ins. My parents, attended synagogue over Zoom and still like hang out with their rabbi over Zoom. Like, so there's I think like thinking about how we integrate, video into different parts of our lives to create a little bit more casual, serendipitous, fun is there's a lot of potential for that. We, despite my reticence to give Mark Zuckerberg more access to my life, we purchased some Facebook portals for our home, which have actually been awesome, like for kids communicating with grandparents and like grandparents reading books virtually to kids over the portal. So that's brought some serendipity for sure. If I walk into a room and I don't actually know there's like a person on the TV, and I'm like, oh, there's my parents. Hi. So I'd say like those types of things, but I'm definitely open to suggestions, because I'm sure I could do better here.
Yeah. So, speaking of the pandemic again, and as you said, it's getting to the end of it here in the US and I guess other parts of the Western world, but it's still raging in other parts of the world. But what are you most looking forward to after the pandemic? What are you most deprived of currently?
Live music is my quick answer. As I mentioned, I'm a musician, and music is really important to me. And I really miss just like being together with friends and family, like at either playing music with people, making music together, or, going to a concert. Like those are the things that are really important to me. And I'm excited to like take my daughters to concerts and just like to make music, interactive, live, in-person music part of my life again. So that's the thing I miss most.
Do you already have tickets for anything?
Yeah, actually I do. One of my CEOs, Rick Nucci, who's CEO of Guru, we had a tradition pre-COVID where we would go to see shows together when we were like in town with each other for board meetings, other things. And we went to a bunch of shows, over the past however many years we've been together. And it's like a really meaningful part of my job and my relationship with him and my life. And that's obviously gone away. So he bought tickets for a show out here in SF in September at the Chase Center. And it's still kind of like crazy to me to think that we'd actually go and see a show, but I'm optimistic it'll happen. So yeah,
I hope that.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. I do hope you can go to that in September. And I think on that note, I'd like to thank you so much, Jake, for being on the podcast today. And I would also like to tell our listeners to check out Emergence Capital, and especially the piece on deep collaboration that Jake wrote. We'll see you soon again for the next episode.
Thanks, Max. Thanks, Till.